Good morning, everybody. It's lovely to see such a lovely bunch of people out on a Sunday morning, a sunny Sunday morning. So thank you very much for coming to attend our event. My name is Tanya Farrelly. I'm the director and founder of Bray Literary Festival. This is the last day of the festival after 5 years. Everybody say, "Aw." Thank you very much. So we have events on all day today. The majority of them are here in the library. We also have Claire Keegan being interviewed by David Butler up in the Mermaid Arts Centre, which I believe is sold out actually. So hopefully you've got your tickets for that if you were hoping to go along. So I'm just going to introduce this event. I am delighted to welcome back Tony Daly from 80/20, Educating and Acting for a Better World. This organisation is based in Bray and they've been involved with the festival from year one. Tony has delivered great talks, he's moderated great discussions over the years, and we're very grateful for their involvement. Today, Tony is going to be talking to Maria McManus and Rosemary Hennigan, who I'm blocking here. So I'm just going to introduce the writers, I'm going to introduce Tony, and then I'm going to hand over. All of the events here in Bray Library are free today. We're doing a collection for Purple House Cancer Support Centre. So if you'd like to maybe come up after the event, if you care to donate to Purple House, they're a fantastic organisation. They deliver a lot of free therapies, counselling, acupuncture, creative writing, which I do with them. But they're fabulous. They're just a great support for people with cancer, cancer survivors, and also their families. So without further ado, let me introduce Maria. So Maria McManus is a poet. Her most recent collection is Available Light from Arlen House. Librettos include Wretches, Ellipsis and Tierra Salada. Dance and film collaborations are Bind, Epilogue, Dust and Turf. Essays are published in Impermanence, Centre Cultural Irlandais and No Alibis, The New Frontier from New Ireland and the Irish Times. She founded Quotidian, Word on the Street, and it includes the Poetry Jukebox, which I think we're all very familiar with. Then we have Rosemary Hennigan. Rosemary published her debut novel, The Truth Will Out, in March 2022. She's been shortlisted for the Benedict Kiley Short Story Competition, longlisted for the Colm Tóibín Short Story Competition, and was highly commended in the Sean O'Faolain Short Story Prize. She's a qualified solicitor who has worked in the NGO sector and is also a Fulbright scholar. I should also mention about Maria that she is a very valued member of Irish Pen. Then we have Tony, who is moderating today. So coordinator of the 80/20 Educating and Acting for a Better World and board member of Fair Trade Ireland and the regional human rights network Euromed Rights. Tony Daly writes, teaches and designs educational activism, initiatives and resources on global justice and inequality issues such as human development, women's rights and climate justice. So please give a big warm welcome today for our panel.
Thank you very much, Tanya, and to everyone involved in Bray Literary Festival over the years and particularly today and this weekend. Great to be back, and the salvo of, there's a bittersweetness to today and being the last day, and congratulations everybody for making it to this morning. It's not easy for a Sunday morning, and I say that to everybody on the panel and in the audience, so not just to say audience, but participants. So we expect people to get stuck in. There's active listening possibilities, but there's also the opportunity to join in. So please feel free to take us up on that as part of this session. So yeah, it's been a pleasure, and thank you for putting on this session. So delighted to be here today and to share the platform and to be in a position of facilitating an open discussion really on a number of topics, particularly on writers responding to conflict, as this session has been proposed. Where do you begin, on a topic like that? I mean, we were chatting a little bit beforehand about, the topic of conflict, and does it belong on an island parked away from lots of other issues? Is it just for academic study on the side, or do we use the word conflict when we're discussing conflict? I know in recent times and recent politics and circumstance across Europe, Eastern Europe and what's going on inside Ukraine and outside of Ukraine, I'm immediately drawn to thinking of conflict in that sense. But there's lots of other places that conflict happens. And I think that's part of the magic and the importance of sessions like this, is to explore the various places that conflict arises and where we find it. I mentioned Ukraine, and there's lots of other examples, of course, based on certainly the last few days of the news, the endless news cycle. I'm looking around at, we're surrounded by the history section here in Bray Library, and mostly by, male voices. I've noticed on a lot of the sleeves as well. And we'll talk about gender and conflict and narratives as well today, which I'd be quite happy to. So just to say welcome. And in terms of just starting us off, and on the, certainly being drawn to a session on responding to conflict in your professional writing lives, where did you begin? Where did you get your ideas from? Certainly, in more recently, we're talking about recent publications as well. Rosemary, your debut novel is just out. You produced it under a global pandemic. Asking that question is almost one that can be answered in different ways. But I'm very happy to ask the question about where you draw inspiration from in terms of how you might make decisions around writing on those issues in your book.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think for me, I was writing my debut novel during the lockdown, and I was working full-time in Focus Ireland at the time, so I was working on homelessness and homeless policy and advocacy. So you're always trying to kind of influence people and influence politics and influence the discussion to kind of bring everyone together on the one page, because that's how you kind of change law, it's how you change politics. And what I was finding a lot was everybody comes at these things from a different perspective, and it can be quite hard to actually draw us together, especially when we're all, by necessity, very far apart. And the internet doesn't really help with that. I found, the platforms that you have are very limited, and everything that you can kind of put out into the world, whether it's as yourself or for an organisation like Focus Ireland, is limited by those platforms and by the kind of the number of characters that you can use, or even just the tone of voice that you can take. And you can feel very distant from people when you need to connect with them most and kind of, convince them to trust you and to trust what you're saying, because you have the expertise and you see what's going on the ground. And so I think that's what really drew me at that time to try and kind of sit down and write that novel, because I was looking at how do you draw different perspectives together, and what are the ways in which our different perspectives can really pull us apart. And it's something that I think writing can do, and novels can do, and poetry can do, which is find a way just to draw us together again and to reflect and to think about things. It is a very fast and very noisy world out there. I'm sure everyone agrees with that, right? It's certainly my experience at the moment. And I think reflecting and using literature and art and poetry to do that is really powerful. And I think Ukraine is a great example of that, because, you have people in Russia at the moment who are perceiving the world completely differently to people in Ukraine. And that creates a really large barrier to peace. And ultimately, presumably that's what we would like to get towards. It's very, very difficult. And so I think sometimes there's a quote, and I can't remember who said it, so I'm not going to claim it myself, but there's a quote, speaking of history, where you ask the historians if you want to know what happened, and you ask the poets and the writers when you want to know how it felt. And I think that's where writing comes into it, and where literature and art and poetry comes into it, and events like this, really, where we come together and we talk and we share. And so for me, that's where writing came from, and that's where the novel came from. It was really looking at it's a group of actors, and they get kind of lost in their characters. And it was that sense of being lost in, in an otherness, I suppose, and in trying to kind of come back together and come back to yourself. So, yeah, that's where that came from for me. Like, ask you the same question, Maria?
I suppose what I'm really aware of is conflict is so universal. It's not always a bad thing. It can be a growth point. It can be evidence of an inequity, or a kind of a place that we need to pay attention to in order to respond. And I mean, I don't go looking for trouble necessarily, but sometimes it finds me. and and I actually, in spite of the fact that I'm really quite an opinionated person, and I don't really hold back necessarily in putting those opinions out into public space either, I'm actually quite inclined to take the long way around to things sometimes. And that the genesis of that comes twofold in a way. One is about, quite obviously, growing up in the north and, you know, having that kind of sweet spot of 5 years when I don't really remember very much except that things were sweet, and becoming acutely aware that things had changed, down to the very games we played and the language that we used in those games. And then there was another thing happening, you know, in terms of growing up in a home that was just completely destructively conflictual. And so it takes a long time, you know, you have to learn ultimately to try and make those things work for you, so that you don't either become over-invested in the fight because it's familiar, and that you become choiceful about the things you fight about. I came to writing a lot later than many people, and there is a through line in my work that is about paying attention to what's contrary to what's foreground, what else is happening. So hence the work with Irish Pen, the commitment to the Poetry Jukebox, which is about amplifying quieter voices, and is a fun intervention in a public space that's so addicted to conflict as Belfast or the North is, you know. So anyway, I'll now and hand it back to you.
Not at all. I just wanted to ask you, Marie, if you wouldn't mind just explaining to our audience what the Poetry Jukebox is about, because I think it's fairly resonant from coming out of what you just said, please.
Okay, so the Poetry Jukebox is an audio installation that you can put in public spaces. It was invented in the Czech Republic by a guy called Andrej Kobza. He wanted to just find interventions in public spaces about things that he liked himself, for poetry. But when I came across the Poetry Jukebox as a poet, I was collaborating with another poet at the time called Deirdre Cartmel. And for me and for us, the philosophy was about actually finding a way to make poetry more public, but also what is the role of poetry for society, and how do you connect more people with what it has to say. So it was kind of this 6 foot tall steel tube, which are brightly blue painted, that people can rock up and kind of out of curiosity push a button and be rewarded for their curiosity with hearing a poem, usually in the poet's own voice, and then we work on that thematically. But at the point that we put the first one into Belfast, we had a lot of, and we still have a lot of really nasty, destructive graffiti. It's hard to kind of push back against that. We have a lot of destructive public discourse, a very conflictual and gladiatorial style of discussion on radio programmes and on television programmes and on politics. A predominance of angry men mostly, or angry people in the round, and a dominance of the same people getting the say all of the time. So in a way, this was an intervention that's hard to measure the impact of, to be honest, but actually it was a way of just being defiant and having a bit of crack, but a serious kind of value system behind that as well, about why this and why now. It wasn't a slight thing at all, and it took an enormous amount of kind of public support to make the first one happen. Does that answer your question?
I think it answers about 4 different questions, actually, in terms of just the work and the substance and the value of just being brave and daring and having fun, remembering to have fun in the midst of where you find troubles. Whether, as you said, you may not seek it out, but troubles have a way of being around, and certainly living in Belfast has its particular realities as a result of that, to put it mildly. But I think there's this idea of being defiant in the midst of lots of other conflicts. I think your comment about trying to reflect and find your way through, to take your time and maybe go the long way round, or to find your own sense of self in the middle of all these other voices that are vying for attention, is a fascinating area about all the different solutions to conflict, or conflict leaders, that would be championing their own approaches, and you trying to actually have your own distance from that and to find how you might choose to respond to that is a hugely powerful thing. And I think the discussion around the 24-hour news cycle and antibodies for that relentless feeding and production, and not even just feeding, but the production of information in itself is hugely challenging, for people who would look to learn, look to think. Do we have a chance to think anymore? How often do we find those spaces? Maybe it's on the podcast at the sink, going around the house. Maybe it's the radio. Do we get to sit down and read for pleasure as much anymore? I mean, I think about the context of this 24-hour news and interrupting how the very flow of our day to day, as you've rightly put, Maria, in terms of the jukebox opportunity on the street and just sprouting almost like a tree out on the pavement, and you can't help but wait, and perhaps it's waiting at the lights to cross the road, and you get to encounter poetry. It's a marvelous thing, and particularly when we know that the information around how attention spans are changing as a result of how we consume things, like on social media, means that it's very challenging to work in artistic spaces when the boundaries of how we're supposed to work keep getting shortened and squoze and reduced, and it's refined to the point where you have a drop in a moment, and what might you do? So I think this is a fascinating and important contribution, actually, and a reminder about being defiant. So thanks for reflecting on that, and I've no doubt you have a lot more to say on that, including about exporting this into places like France, and your the championing of it beyond Belfast. And I think this conflict isn't just about Belfast; it's about, in the context of Belfast, it's about Dublin, it's about Bray, and listening. What poetry might we hear from the streets of Belfast, and should we be hearing? I must imagine visualising on a ship the similar kinds of funnels that the jukebox poetry was created around. It's like a funnel that sticks out of the ground, and imagine hearing someone else on a different part of the ship, or it could be an island, it could be between countries, but this idea of listening across and listening to each other, and the power of listening actually as a result changes quite differently when you have this physical object that you can interact with. And I believe the same of books, that it's an object to hold as well. It isn't just a digital thing to have in your in a folder on your computer. So there's something about the texture and the folding and the leafing and the marking up that's quite important. Just in terms of the 24 news cycle, I know that Rosemary, you talked quite a bit about having to make decisions about how you might like to focus your attention to that, and trying to do something that isn't just about the news messages, but it is about connecting to truth and what is true. How do you find meaning when you're bombarded with so many things that are confusing, contradictory. I know just how you make decisions about all the ranges of competing messages around conflict. How do you decide to focus in on that point? I'm very interested to know. And I have a separate comment about your comment earlier before we started up. You said you're not a fighter. This coming from a solicitor. Don't believe a word that she says there, because the fight is in you, and I think your work and your contributions in the Truth Will Out suggest otherwise. But I just wanted to say that to you, that fighting isn't just about using your fists. Of course, it's lots of other ways. But yeah, just to.
Yeah, I think probably for everyone, it's kind of it can feel quite a dizzying time, just in terms of the scale of change and how quickly it's happening, and how quickly a lot of our assumptions about the world around us are kind of, undermined. It's things like a pandemic, which was entirely unforeseen and unforeseeable before it happened. Things like, Russia invading its neighbour. There are things that, when I was younger, when I was growing up in the 90s, I just thought wouldn't happen again. It was that sense of all that is past. We're finished with that. And I think for a lot of younger people, but I don't want to just limit it to younger people. I just know that there's a lot of assumptions that you would have had about what your life might look like in the next 20, 30 years, that people are kind of saying, well, actually, maybe not. I don't even know if the sea levels will be at the same level or whatever it is. And so there's I think a sense amongst, certainly not even my generation, but younger again, of just deep, deep uncertainty. And that affects everything in terms of your choices about, your life, your job, your education, but also just how you see yourself in the world around you. And I think it's that kind of sense of the ground shifting under you that gives people a huge amount of anxiety. And we're living in a time of huge anxiety, and you're looking around for things to hold on to. And I think oftentimes the simpler narratives are the things that you feel you kind of clutch at more easily. And that's where the conspiracies come from, and that's where you can kind of find people kind of slipping down into kind of pots of understanding that just seem to everybody else a little bit strange. But for them, that's where they're getting their comfort. And I think understanding that is important, because how else do you say, well, look, maybe that's not quite the case, and here is the data, and here is, the reality. But I suppose I worry a lot about that, those kind of tears between us, tears in the fabric of society around us that are happening, slowly and over time. And how do you pull people back together? And how do you kind of say to us, look, we're all sharing the earth at the same time, and we're all experiencing, in a big way or a small way, some of what it is to be alive right now and the challenges that are there. And I think understanding that is the way around conflict. And I suppose that's what I mean by I'm not a fighter. It's fundamentally, I do fight all the time in my professional life. But what I find is better than kind of barking down the phone at someone is to say, look, what are your concerns? What are your interests in saying, no, this person isn't entitled to X, Y, or Z under the law? Where are you coming from? And how can I explain to you what this person needs and why they should be entitled to X, Y, or Z under the law? And finding that common ground, when you can talk to somebody and get them to say, well, actually, look, the reason we can't give this person that is because she hasn't done this, and if she hasn't done that, and then we can kind of get to an understanding, and we can work around it, and we can find solutions that are pragmatic and that are practical, and that will actually get people, into the house that they're entitled to, or, into homeless services or whatever it is. But getting to that point can be really difficult, because everyone comes with these blockages of, well, I don't know who this person is, and she's been nagging me now for a week, and, I told her to get this letter, and she didn't get that letter, and I have to say, well, she didn't get the letter because she ended up in hospital with her child. And then the person on the other side of the phone will say, oh, right, I didn't understand that. And then you kind of are connecting as human beings, and you're kind of saying to them, I know that this person in the abstract is just a problem for you on your file, but when you see them as a person, you'll understand that actually they're just trying their best like everyone else. And that's been kind of the lesson for me as a lawyer, and kind of in the NGO sector, and kind of meeting people who've had problems that are far worse than anything I could have ever imagined for myself. And, being very lucky in terms of my kind of origins in life, having to kind of realise that not everyone is that way at all, and understanding that has been a huge education for me. And then in terms of the writing, I think it's just reflecting all the time on other people's perspectives and how they view the world, and trying to get out of my own head and kind of see things from a much more rounded way. And again, I think that's what books can do, and it's what books can do in crisis. And it's why, in a pandemic, it was all I wanted to do was just get away from the real world and into something else, into kind of, other perspectives. So yeah, I'm not sure if that answered your question, but I'll give it back to you.
Yeah. Thanks. I suspect, Marie, you might have something to say on that topic as well. And I know you mentioned that conflict isn't always a bad thing. And, taking very much Rosemary's leaf there about, the perspective taking is at the root of your choices and working through how you'd like to focus and just taking stock of your day to day and slowing it down. And it is about perspectives, and certainly the truth will out is all about perspective taking. And I think, so I'm very interested in your responses certainly to that it isn't always a bad thing in terms of conflict. And, what do you mean by that, and what perspective were you taking exactly? Because I'm very curious to that.
I suppose if I were to draw on the experience of some of the things that we're currently dealing with in Irish Pen, for example, the conflict may exist in any case. You look at what's happening, for example, in relation to one of the things we're doing some considerable work on at the minute is with journalists in Northern Ireland coming under threat from paramilitaries and criminal gangs, for example. Normally, the work that PEN does is actually responding to conflicts between writers and the state. So Northern Ireland has ended up being a little bit, it's not unique, but what is there to learn from casting our eyes and our collective intelligence down into that we can make some meaningful interventions? We can't solve it all. We can't make people stop making threats. We can't stop the police turning up at your door to deliver those threats on behalf of the paramilitaries to say, your life is under threat. We can't do anything about that. But what we can do is provide solidarity to the journalists, reduce their isolation. We can collaborate together to make ourselves more aware of the nuances of the problems, find resources to help those journalists push back through the legal system and support themselves, and build a coalition amongst us and an international awareness of, because if it's happening here, these things are likely to be happening in other places, and to then, in a way begin to activate an international community around awareness and looking for those dynamics elsewhere. So there's something about being measured on the one hand and realistic about boundaries, about absolutely acting from a set of values around your intention of what is it that you're attempting to achieve, and paying attention to what the consequences of your own actions are then. What happens that is working? What is an unintended consequence that may be a negative thing? For example, if we are aware of what's happening for writers in Myanmar, it may not necessarily be a good thing that we draw attention to those individuals, because we may inadvertently be putting them at risk in their own countries. However, once the Myanmar government shut down an Irish writer, Ronan Lee, for the academic book that he had written about what's happening there with the Rohingya, and shut down a press within Myanmar that was sharing his work, that gives us a much stronger platform to intervene on his behalf and draw attention to making the wider world more aware of what's happening there. And there's something about saying, being realistic about not necessarily having control over what happens when you act, but being choiceful about how you act on the basis of what your interventions are, and being value-driven. And I think that comes back to, we live in a world that rewards people for action. We live in a world that is very immediate, through the media and so on, that provokes us to be reactive. And actually, the skills we need to instill in ourselves and pay attention to are about reflection, listening, and having some kind of a through line that is based on values, I think, and trying to build a coalition. You know, I've given some examples of things that we're doing with Irish Pen, and we're very intentional also that is a north-south, it's an all-island group, and we're really very committed to that as part of the dialogue about all manner of things that are going on, you know, but we have to pay attention to what the consequences are for us, and find a through line. But equally, if I were to say about the Poetry Jukebox, from the get-go, it has been an all-Ireland project, and a number of the writers who've submitted work and been included in that are here today, and that's a really heartwarming thing for me, and thank you for turning up here. But you know, that the poets then start to see themselves as a little band of people who are also finding ways to talk about things, seeing that our work has meaning not only amongst the poets themselves, but to a wider society. The poems have work to do. And one of the most, I'll finish now in a minute, but one of the most heartwarming things I've seen was just after we launched the first Poetry Jukebox in Belfast. I was sitting in the bay window of the Arts Centre waiting to speak to a journalist or something, and a wee nipper of 3 or 4 came bouncing through the gates of the Arts Centre and ran straight up, pushed the button of the jukebox, the poem comes out, and her mum came in behind her, scooped her up in her arms, and the two of them just stood there and had a moment together. You know, and it's those things. It's those things. That is a parent engaging in a life-affirming way with a child because of the thing. And I believe in literature in that way. I believe in art to do that. You know, that a child... Some of the best times I had as a parent myself were bedtime books, you know. And many times they're falling asleep before the children are. But, you know, those little wee moments, and actually that we are modelling the way, you know, with each other, to be the thing, you know, not just talk about it, not just shout about it, not just protest, although I also believe in those things at times too, but be the thing. And actually another wee thing that I pay attention to also in our work in Irish Pen, but with the Jukebox projects, is what can we do that will be replicable in other places with other content? What can we do that can be shared in how we go about what it is that we're doing, and not hold that to ourselves, you know, that you become an example that, or share the ways of doing things. So like the Labels project or the Jukebox, or, you know, I don't know, those kind of things are about kind of being excited about seeing what someone else will develop from that idea and do in another way. Does that make sense?
Thanks for that, Jen. It makes a lot of sense, and I have a feeling we could be talking about this for pretty much the rest of the day. And in many ways, I would like to, but time is against us. But no, thanks for sharing. Certainly, you know, the development of the project, and you know, your sense of perspective and how that can change. I think it's hugely moving. I think this phrase, I wrote it down: the poems have work to do. I love that. You know, how do you measure what that work is? You know, and how might you, account for that over a 5-year period of siblings and parents passing along, and I wonder what's on it this year, and the change that might come from that interruption to the day-to-day life of just the flow of walking and passing. It almost reminds me of as motorways get built, we don't get to stop being on towns anymore as much, and we don't get to interact with people as much. So from just that analogy of travelling in cars, the kind of the high consumption, fast pace of today means that we miss out on, I think, the opportunity to interact and to have experiences in many ways. And I think it's great to just, rather than seeking permission, you're kind of like, it's going to stop you on your track or your conveyor belt or your route. I think it's and literature has that power in many ways. And I think the embodiment that you've talked about is very powerful as well. And that we're modelling as well, that we're, that modelling, in the context of writers responding to conflict, which what we're talking about today. I'm thinking about all the courses, as I mentioned earlier, we're kind of sitting in the history section, parked in the history section of the library, and I think about all the war departments and war sections and war institutes that exist, and I wonder how they'd weigh up against peace institutes and peace building departments, peace and reconciliation units, and just the importance that the arts and literature play in that work. As you rightly said, they've work to do, and your work factors very much in that canon of peace building, of managing conflict, of not just observing it, but actually working through it. And the hard work of doing that is presented, and the opportunity is there in very much in the work that you've done. I can see Shakespeare getting disrupted, in The Truth Will Out, very much so, and rightly so in many ways. And I think it's great as a callback, to call it that, as they'd say in TV. It's a good callback, but it's an important one, because it means that there's meaning in looking back in that, but also how we might internalize the conflict to the point where we can develop tools of managing it, responding to it, as opposed to just observing it. It's kind of your role as a protagonist in it as well. It isn't just an observer to conflict, but how we manage it becomes quite important, because it's everywhere in lots of different ways. So thanks for that. Just in terms of, you're clearly we're in a panel here of two esteemed women writers, and conflict, as I mentioned, with history is mostly led, or at least we hear a lot from male voices historically, and certainly being women responding to conflict. How has that been for you in terms of just your writing and finding your path and managing it as women as well? And I say that deliberately, knowing that the context of putting yourself out there carries risks today in lots of ways, without even having to leave the island of Ireland on that question. We know that. So I'm curious as to how your voice as women in managing conflict has informed your perspective taking, your work.
Yeah, it's interesting, because obviously I can only kind of answer that question as a woman and from my own perspective as a woman, so I can't kind of compare it to how I would have had an experience as a man, so I'm kind of conscious of that. But at the same time, you do feel, I think, particularly as a woman, a pressure to be likeable and to be kind of soft and gentle, I suppose, sometimes. That is what you're kind of expected to be, I think, sometimes. And when you do introduce the conflict, which is necessary at times, you can feel a tension almost seeping into the room. And I think we're not really accustomed as a society to hearing women's voices when we're angry and when we are in that moment of conflict because something is going wrong, or something needs to be heard. And I think that's why a lot of kind of problems for women have just continued for years. And, the Me Too movement and all of that was a kind of a flash in the dark almost for kind of women kind of standing up and saying, here is a conflict that we need to point to and we need to talk about. And I know a lot of women who did stand forward and say, I'm ready to speak now and I'm ready to be heard. But that's difficult because we're not really, like, that was a very unusual moment and we don't really have those moments. Conflict tends to be very different. It tends to be a male voice, I think, and it tends to be a male leader and, a male kind of politician at the front of it and all of that. And I don't know that we're used to managing conflict as women to the same extent. That's definitely my experience of it. So I can't say it more generally than that. But yeah, and it is difficult. It is difficult to put yourself out there, particularly these days, online or with a book. You know, you are open to criticism, some criticism that is totally fair. It's just, you know, whether or not somebody liked your book, it's an, you know, very fair game. But then there's other things that you do get because you have kind of social media platforms and all that kind of stuff, that people will send you messages, and there are times when they're very hostile, and maybe that's because you're a woman, maybe it's not, maybe it's you're just annoying to the person, I don't know. But yeah, you do feel kind of exposed in that way, and I don't really know how you protect yourself from it, except, as you say, to kind of rely on other people and build those communities and put up those boundaries. But yeah, it's a challenge, and I don't think we kind of, as a society, really know how to manage it yet. Maria, you probably have a reflections on it as well.
I suppose you just need good shit detectors every now and again, you know, to pick your fights on the one hand. I think the other thing is actually there are loads of voices that are getting shut down. Older people, for example, older women. I mean, it's a really shocking and quite a toxic thing. You know, as you get older, to realise that, and it's painful actually, that sometimes it's younger women have internalised a lot of misogyny that would shut down older women quicker than men would at times. It's weird. But sometimes that happens, you know. I think also, if I were to speak for myself, one of the reasons, I reckon I had an aspiration to be a writer from I was very small, but I protected that. I protected myself from that, let alone protecting the world from that for a very long time, you know. I didn't inflict myself on the world for in that way for a long time, but that actually, you know, it's never too late to have a happy childhood, let's put it that way. It's never too late to play. And I think that for me, as a woman, yeah, you do become aware of certain dynamics that would shut you down. I mean, it's why I'm kind of doing what I'm doing, and why I'm not. I was never tough enough to be in politics, despite the fact that I had many things that I would have liked to engage with, and I certainly wasn't going to do that in the north, where it was like a bear pit, you know. So, yeah. There's an individual journey that anybody has to go through, and I suppose that's the other thing I'm really conscious that people, traveller community, LGBT community, many of our young men, you know, our young people really struggle to express themselves effectively, and you can often feel that is coming from the outside in. And some of it is coming from the outside in, but some of it is a censorship that you buy into yourself, where you've internalised the rules the world have given you. And the most empowering thing can be to work on disinterring that, going inwards and working out, well, what's my part in this in the first instance, and what's my part in perhaps shutting down other voices that also need to be heard. Does that? I'm sorry, I feel like I've kind of went down another rabbit hole there, but it's kind of, there are two things. One is that society needs to change, and the other bit, it's always worthwhile going inside and asking, and what's my part in this? And then pick your fights. It's my theme, isn't it?
Great, thanks, Marie. Pick your fights. Yeah, no, I think we've definitely got a one-page top tips coming out of today's session. Summarise, pick your fights. But no, thank you for that. And you know, there's quite a lot in there. Yeah, it's never too late. Never too late to play. You know, never too late to have a happy childhood. You know, being able to slow down and process is actually really important, and I think your confidence, to give confidence to others to do that is kind of one of the key driving messages of fighting, is actually making sense of things yourself, but also about what kind of communities you build by the practices that you are involved in. Because working as a poet and working as a writer, I imagine, is solitary confinement. However, at the best of times, it's solitary confinement with a little window. But it's the communities that can be built through the practicing and reaching out and talking to other poets and talking to the writers, and the struggle is really where you can forge some of this identity building, sharing in the cause, or sharing in the writing, or sharing in the conflicts of working through. That is actually really important, and certainly that not going alone is part of it.
Can I say?
Yes, of course.
Oops. For us as writers, we can often think that the work we do is about us. And one of the most liberating things for writers can be to say, this is not about me. That whatever work the work has to do is a higher order thing. And actually, and I think I'll say this as a poet, is I think we're inclined to be incredibly self-absorbed, and the default can be sometimes of thinking that it is about us as individuals, but it's a really healthier, happier place for us all when we're kind of going, and how does this connect? How does this travel the distance to the other? And what difference does it make when it gets there? And how do we then also look out for each other in that process and not be so with our elbows out,
Sorry. No, I was just going to pass it across.
Thanks for that. I think the distance it might travel is an interesting question, and just something is all part of the process. I think the deep uncertainty that that was mentioned around doing the production of work and the context that you're producing in. You just reminded me of years ago we were involved in my organisation in 80-20 years ago we were involved in decommissioning wall murals in Northern Ireland when it wasn't a popular thing to do. I'm not saying it's popular now to do that, but the idea of taking on some of the symbols that are being drawn up and illustrated and reinforced and conditioned generation after generation, and slowing down and asking, well, what would you like to see on the walls? And negotiating that space with local communities of different communities, on all sides, was kind of hard work, but it was something that belonged to the community as opposed to the leaders of communities only. And this process of being able to unpack and reimagine is actually really important. I'm reminded of, I think it was in 2016, I read an article in the New Scientist, in the letters pages, highly recommended, of two climate scientists arguing about what their roles should be around the climate justice and climate change agendas. And I remember one scientist arguing, we need to just get out of the way and let the artists and the playwrights and the arts community do their thing, because we know what the story is. Everybody knows. We need to just stop taking up that limelight. And I think the role of challenge and articulating hope in a context of huge conflict is really important, and you can see the scientists arguing about and understanding their roles, but the arts and literature, of course, has a huge opportunity and responsibility around that. And I think my question really drawn from that is about the role of writing hope in conflict. How do you find that? And how did you find that in your work? Yeah.
Sure. I think hope for me is in that connection and that sense. When you're reading something and you come across it's the passage or a line or something, and you think, I had that thought. Like I've felt that the exact thing that is kind of summarized in that book or in that poetry. I have felt that way, and this other human being, walking around the earth has had the same thought. That to me, that moment where you think, I'm not alone in this. I'm not alone in the uncertainty. I'm not alone in the questioning and the wondering or any of that. I'm not alone in the worry about the future and the climate. That's where the hope comes from, because we can pull together. We've done it before and we can do it again. But I just firmly believe that we need to find a way to do that again as quickly as possible. And I think part of the challenge is finding a language for that, which is speaking to something that, it does provoke that kind of fear and that anxiety in us, I think, to think about how bad things might get, or how bad things are at the moment. And I think a lot of us are just tired, and don't want to go there. And I think that's fair as well. But I do think there is an obligation on us to say, look, we do need to face these things and to find a way through. And I think the way to do that is to focus on the things that draw us together and the ways in which we are, a united kind of community living together at this particular point in time. I think that's what art can do. And it does it not by dogma, because I think when you do that, you're kind of forcing someone into a very didactic situation where you're being told how to feel and how to respond. And I think we all kind of go, well, I'll decide that for myself, And so instead of that, I think you need to say, well, how about thinking about things this way? Or here is a mirror of how I see the world, and maybe you see it the same way, or maybe you don't. But that's where I think the arts has its role. And yeah, I think for me, hope is always it's the most human thing, really, isn't it? At the end of the day, is that sense of, right, well, things are bad, but they will get better. I think that's one of the most fundamental things about being a human being is, remembering hope.
I think also there's something about coming to terms with your own dark side. That's really important in trying to understand why somebody else might act or behave in really destructive ways. And I'm saying that, and I don't feel comfortable about this necessarily, but when you're a young mother on your own, a lot with a tiny baby that will not stop crying. For me, my experience of that was twofold. One is I felt a murderous rage that scared the life out of me. That was real. And now what you do is you put the baby in the other room and you go elsewhere and you wait till the feeling passes. But the other thing was sitting alongside that and living as I was at the time in Belfast at the height of the Troubles, was experiencing that corresponding murderous rage where I would have killed to protect her. And realising that those are really deeply human experiences that we are also hardwired for. Now, the fact that you never act on those things, and you have, and I own this for me, that you don't act on that you have a very clear limit on what you will do with your own behaviour. But it's a humanising thing to actually own that kind of primal instinct is also there in all of us. And that how we moderate ourselves, the situations we put ourselves in, the choices we make, the people we hang out with, the responses to the things that we absorb and read and share, and our pursuit of the truth are all choices, but you have to absolutely commit to that. And part of that is about really come to terms with the fact that every one of us also has a dark side that we have to pay heed to. And it was a morning like this about when would it be? 20 years ago, that I was sitting like this amongst a group of writers and a guy giving a talk on a Sunday morning, and he said, I believe that art can save the world. And it's like a really grandiose statement on the one hand, and actually it was just such a moment of truth for me when he said that. It was like literally been hit hard in the solar plexus, something unlocking, and it did change me I didn't know what it meant at the time, but it did change me and changed the entire trajectory of my life thereafter. You know, to just reflect on that one phrase. And the context of it was that 9/11 had just happened. You know, warships were patrolling up and down the Irish Sea, the world in absolute chaos, going, what does this mean for us? And you kind of think, well, actually, our response, a legitimate response, is the commitment to art, because it builds humanity and it is a place for the truth. It is a place for the dark stuff also, and the dark places that we need to go. And that's a healthy thing, I think.
Ooh, I'm not sure how to respond to that. No, it's some serious. You know, we ask for reflections and we're getting them. And I thank you for such deep felt personal reflections on internal conflicts. It could be very easy to just look externally into the external world in terms of who we are, where we are, and conflict is out there. But actually, the conflict of being, you know, a human being and finding your own humanity in the context of lots of things going on that are inhumane and full of conflict that are happening to you. Whether you give yourself the time to grow and to nurture and to explore and to think and reflect, whether you even have that time. Maybe I'll do it when they turn 18, you know. Maybe I'll do it when I don't have 40 clients that I'm dealing with at the moment, and all the things that you shoulder, and being able to work through all of that, the conflict that you are faced with in terms of that endless list is nothing to dismiss. It's not a small thing in terms of this kind of discussion, and, you know, responding to conflict is as much, as you're saying, is much about how I respond to my own conflicts of competing interests and everybody's expectations and my own expectations, and working through it as much as it is to the external world. So thank you for reminding us of that. It's actually, it's not an end point or an addendum or a follow-on. It's actually core to lots of the things that have been raised. So thanks, Maria. Are there any, just to put it out to our participants, not our audience, if anybody has any questions for our panellists, for Rosemary or for Maria, you're very welcome to pose a question, given the topic, or certainly if there's something from their work you would like to see if they remember it line for line, word for word. I think Maria's particularly up for that. But yeah.
I just wanted to ask Rosemary a little bit.
Sorry, I'll bring the mic over just so we can pick up. Yeah.
I just wanted to ask Rosemary a little more about her novel.
Always great to be able to talk about the novel, so thank you. So it's about a group of actors who are preparing for a play that is very controversial because it's about a boy who had died in very strange circumstances, and the play is written by the only witness to his death. And so there's a question about, you know, is she telling the truth, or how much of the truth is she revealing? And as the actors are kind of preparing for it, they get pulled deeper and deeper and deeper into that open question of what are we portraying, and why are we telling this story, and who does the story serve? And then they get them kind of increasingly lost in their own characters, as well as the kind of ground shifts under them. They lose their sense of self and that anchoring sense, and are very bewildered. And I think just to tie it into the topic of today, I think it's that kind of that sense of losing your core sense and of self and identity that is the kind of the heart of the novel in a lot of ways. And I mean, it's not I don't think it is a very hopeful novel, to be honest with you, not to kind of give away the ending, but it's certainly about loops and kind of, you know, patterns of behavior that can get very set in groups and in people, and in, you know, it's about trying to break out of that, I think, a lot of times. But sometimes there are people who are kind of filled with conflict and who bring that conflict into your life. And unless you do find that boundary and that way of stepping away from it, you can find yourself in really under their pull and in a thrall that is very destructive. And so yeah, I think it's about trying to find solid ground under you. But I won't say whether they do or they don't. Yeah, exactly.
Great, thanks. Yep.
Can I just say something to Maria. First of all, I just wanted to say I thought it was excellent that you brought up the dark side in all of us, because it's very much to the fore at the moment. You know, if you look around the world, in Italy, you know, obviously Russia, Ukraine, and across the water as well, with the muddle of British politics and Brexit and all that. And America, hugely, Jesus, it's like a political thriller in real time. You know, it's just, I would find it difficult to, you know, that phrase of Heaney's hope and history rhyme. I find it difficult to believe that at the moment. I find it difficult to believe that art will save us, though I would like to think that. So I just wanted to acknowledge that, and I thought it was great that you brought that up. The other thing I just wanted to ask you, on a much lighter note, was did the installation, the poetry jukebox, wonderful. It looks like a kind of cross between a foghorn and a periscope and a yellow submarine, I think. Did it survive the graffiti in Belfast? Or?
Do you know?
Because I remember that installation.
Yeah, we've had now, as of yesterday, we've had 3 incidents of vandalism in 5 years,
Yeah.
and at this stage 7 jukeboxes. So that's all right. That's all right.
Yeah.
Somebody in Cork has gone out and tagged it with a marker. That's fine. Somebody in Belfast, I suspect, it reversed a lorry into one and broke the wee speaker mesh. That then somebody opportunistically went at with a lump hammer, or similar, or maybe some spied with their head. You know, I don't know. And we had that happened a second time, but actually, in the round, very little, really very little. And I mean, those things are easily fixed. It's really robust. And I think if anybody really had a go at the jukebox, they might come off worst.
Sorry, yep. Over to you, Liz.
Well, first of all, thank you very much indeed for, I think, quite a profound discussion. And I'm really very grateful that you sat down and you provided us with very thoughtful, thought-provoking discussion. And it really made me think what a loss Bray Literary Festival will be to us. And I want to acknowledge Tanya and David and all the work and your committee have done. I know it's been tremendous work and nobody underestimates the commitment, but it will be a loss for us. And I'm very grateful to be sitting here on a sunny Sunday morning listening to the 3 of you. And thank you for that. Maria, but may I just say, Maria, politics has also experienced a loss that you didn't choose to get involved. But then again, maybe politics isn't ready for you. But could you just tell us where the jukeboxes are, please? Thank you.
Thanks. So, of the ones that we have, one is permanently outside of the Crescent Arts Centre in Belfast. One is currently outside of the library in Cork. Another is in Waterford and due to move to Dungarvan this incoming week. We have one in storage, is about to go back out to do its work in Cultureland. There's one at the Patrick Kavanagh Centre in Monaghan, and there's one at Centre Culturel Irlandais in Paris. And we're about to get one, our big news, is that we got the money to buy one entirely and dedicated to the Irish language. Hip hip. Woo! So we'll work with Cultureland in Belfast as the main home and the main hub for that, but watch that space. It's an incredible thing and lovely for us that we managed to do that. So thank you. And then the Czechs just invent them and they stick them on mountains and out in the middle of the boonies all over the Czech Republic.
Great, thanks for that. Any other questions? from anybody here? No? Crisis for writers. I think, the topic, this topic evokes quite a lot, and thank you, Liz, for the extra comments there in terms of the power of being able to talk about this stuff openly. People are here as part of this session who are curious about the writings of our panelists. Some have read them, sometimes one, sometimes none. And that's the magic, I think, of this kind of audience and this group of participants, is that we can encounter a lot of what's in the mix by just being here. And I think being here is actually really important in terms of working through a number of the areas that have been highlighted today. So look, that's just an acknowledgement of your time, but also acknowledging that it is power in terms of just that reflection piece and what you might want to do. And maybe there's an audiobook, or maybe I'll go to Belfast or Cork and have a listen, or I'm waiting on the podcast or the audiobook, I think, of The Truth Will Out. And I'm just reminded, being in the library space here, that when it comes to young children starting primary school for the first time, they're given a bag. And in that bag, you get them from the local libraries, and there's a range of books in there. And there's a range of things that are there to try and develop antibodies for what's coming. And it includes how to manage bullying, but also how to manage difference. You like things and other people like other things from you, and what do you do about that? And maybe someone might be interested in the thing that you're interested in. And I think there's a really important work to be done in reading through that and having that. And I'm reminded, and I think about that in the context of a festival like this and a session like this, in terms of what kind of bag of tricks would we like to bring away for us to process. And certainly I'd recommend the work of our authors. Of course I would. I'm paid to say that. So what's the meaning? What's the meaning behind the message? I'm not going to get out of that. But also, I have to say, Bray Library has been, libraries are important for all kinds of reasons that I don't think I have to lecture anyone on in this room. I think one of the first years we were talking about fake news on one of the sessions in the Harbour Bar a few years ago. And at the same time, I remember there was a stand put out, and it was just after the elections in America, when politics changed and updated for the current period we're in. And I remember over on the one of the stands there, you had George Orwell's 1984, and you had a whole load of how to, literacy work around taking on information and disinformation and malinformation. And just the important work of exposing ourselves to that and encountering it, and the spaces like libraries to being open to learning and being actually open and having a disposition is really important. And the fact that it is free and freely available is in itself about the good that comes from just being open to going to the library and calling in. It isn't all online. Here we are. None of us I haven't seen many people checking their phones actually in the last hour. So I think there's value in remembering that and acknowledging that as well. So I just wanted to say that. But I think we're okay to leave it there. I'll leave final words to our authors, really, in terms of final comments on the session today. But just I want to say, on behalf of Bray Literary Festival and the opportunity I've had to facilitate this conversation, I'm very grateful, and thank you for your forthrightness. Yeah.
I'll just say a very quick thank you to everyone for coming, and I hope you got something out of it, and thanks for sharing your perspectives as well, and to yours, Maria, as well. And thank you very much to Bray Literary Festival. It's been great, and best of luck with everything going forward. I know it won't be a festival, but hopefully something else. Yeah. It takes time, doesn't it?
Yeah. Thank you to everybody who has come out this morning. I mean, really, I expected my husband to be here, but but not really anybody else. And he's loyal, Still there, Martin, you are. But the other thing, just to say, is back up what Tony's saying in relation to libraries. They are free, available. They're hubs. They're so important to communities, so important to the life of countries in a way. It's great to meet Rosemary and Tony, and please do keep in touch. And Tanya, I know that while Bray Lit Festival steps down and that's the end of it, the upside is you'll be having more time available for your own work, because it comes from the same source, this creativity, and that is consequence. You've done your bit. Now, go off and do your other bit. So, and write amazing things.
Thank you so much for those kind words, Maria and Liz and everybody else. You've been fantastic over the years. You've been really great at supporting the festival, so thank you so much for that. I'm going to lock the doors now so that you'll have to stay for the next event, because our next event is at 12:30, and I'm going to be talking to author Susan Knight about her Mrs. Hudson series. She took the character of Mrs. Hudson, Sherlock Holmes' landlady, and has written a lovely series of books, and we'll be talking about the popularity, the enduring popularity of Sherlock Holmes as well. So if we have any Sherlock Holmes enthusiasts, please do keep your seat. I'd also just like to say thanks to our sponsor. Our main sponsor is the Arts Council of Ireland, who sponsored this event, and thank you very much to Bray Library for facilitating us this morning and for actually sponsoring the next event, the Sherlock Holmes event. So thank you very much, and I do hope you'll stick around.